One afternoon, he actually explained his plan. If she got pregnant, he'd researched abortion clinics in neighboring towns, found one that didn't require identification. He'd pose as her father and take care of everything.
Please subscribe and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent.
Sarah remembers the church parking lot that Wednesday evening when she was 11. The streetlights had this orange glow that made everything look slightly unreal, and the parking lot was practically empty except for a few scattered cars. She stood at the top of the basement stairs, gripping that cold metal railing so hard her knuckles went white, listening to the sound of other kids laughing down below. And God, she wanted to turn around and go home. She'd always been that kid, the type, the one who sat alone at lunch, who somehow never knew what to say when the popular kids walked by, who felt like she was watching everyone else's life through a window. Sarah, there you are. That was David Mitchell, the youth pastor. He was standing halfway down those stairs with this smile that just made you feel seen. That's the only way to describe it. Like you were the most important person in the world right at that moment. He was 40 years old, had his own kids in the youth group, which somehow made him seem safer, more trustworthy. Like if he had kids of his own, he must understand kids, right? Sarah went down those stairs, and honestly, she felt her whole body relax. Because here's the thing about Sarah's life back then. Her dad worked these brutal hours at the factory. He'd come home so tired he could barely speak. Her mom was doing her best, but there were 3 other kids demanding attention. And Sarah had learned pretty early on to just not need things, to keep herself small, to stay quiet. But she was hungry for someone to actually see her, to care about what she thought or felt. And David seemed to understand that without her having to say a single word. Over the next few months, something shifted. David started paying attention to her in a way that felt really special. He'd remember these tiny details she'd mentioned in passing, like how she was stressed about a test or how she'd said something about her favorite book. He'd ask her about her schoolwork, praise her when she shared something during Bible study. The other kids would make jokes and he'd laugh, but when Sarah said something thoughtful, his whole face would light up like she'd just discovered something profound. "You're really thoughtful," he told her one night after everyone else had cleared out. "Most kids your age don't think about things as deeply as you do." And listen, when you're 11 years old and you've spent your whole life feeling invisible, hearing that, it's like someone finally turned on a light inside you. Someone saw her. Someone thought she was special. Here's where it gets complicated, though, because the boundaries started shifting so gradually that Sarah never noticed when things actually changed. It wasn't like there was this one big moment where everything went wrong. David started offering her rides home from the youth group, and her mom always said yes because, his daughter Rachel was Sarah's friend. It made perfect sense. What Sarah didn't realize, what she couldn't have realized at 11, was that he always dropped Rachel off first, even though her house was farther away. He was creating these pockets of time when it was just the 2 of them in the car, alone. And during those drives, he talked to her like she was an adult. He'd ask her opinion on things, share little frustrations about his day, make her feel mature and important and valued. Sometimes he'd rest his hand on her shoulder while he drove, and it felt fatherly, comforting, safe. Sarah started spending more time at their house. Rachel was a year younger, one of those energetic, bubbly girls who seemed to float through life without a care, and Sarah kind of envied that. The sleepovers became this regular thing. And here's a detail that matters. When Sarah stayed over, she didn't sleep in Rachel's room. She slept on the couch in the basement family room, even though all the bedrooms were upstairs. She never questioned it. Why would she? It seemed logical enough at the time. The first time Sarah woke up to find David kneeling beside the couch, her heart nearly jumped out of her chest. The room was dark except for this faint glow from a nightlight in the hallway, and there he was, his face close to hers, just watching her. "I didn't mean to startle you," he whispered. "I came down to pray for you. I do that sometimes, pray for the kids in our group while they sleep." Now, if you're hearing this as an adult, every alarm bell in your head is probably screaming right now. But Sarah was 12 years old, and she thought this was the most touching thing she'd ever heard. She felt cared for in a way she'd never experienced before. This man, this important person who everyone respected, was praying for her while she slept. Her eyes were actually filled with tears. Gratitude tears. It became a pattern after that. When she stayed over, he'd come down to the basement. The prayers turned into these whispered conversations in the dark. And then one night, she mentioned that her shoulders hurt from carrying her heavy backpack at school, and he offered to rub her back. His hands were warm through her t-shirt, working at these knots of tension she didn't even know she was carrying. It felt nice, parental, caring. When his hands slipped under her shirt, skin against skin, Sarah stiffened for just a second, but then she forced herself to relax. He was just being thorough, right? He was helping her feel better. This was fine. This was normal. Except it wasn't normal. But how was she supposed to know that? There was this incident with a shower curtain that still makes Sarah's stomach turn when she thinks about it. She'd gone upstairs to use the bathroom one day and took advantage of the bigger shower with better water pressure than the basement had. She came back down, wrapped in a towel, hair dripping wet, and David pulled her aside into the laundry room. His face was all serious, almost pained. "Sarah, I need to apologize to you. The curtain in that bathroom, it doesn't close all the way. I walked past earlier and I saw you. I'm so sorry. I should have warned you about the curtain." Sarah's face burned. She felt this crushing wave of embarrassment and shame. She couldn't even look at him, just nodded and mumbled that it was okay. Accidents happen. No big deal. Here's what Sarah didn't understand until years later. If he'd actually accidentally seen something, the kind thing, the right thing would have been to say nothing, to spare her that humiliation. But he told her. He made sure she knew he'd seen her. And that conversation, that moment of manufactured shame and apology, it was another brick in the wall he was building around her, another way to make her feel exposed and vulnerable and somehow indebted to him for his honesty. But at 13, she didn't have the life experience to see any of that. She just felt grateful that he'd apologized. Because that's what good people do, right? The winter ski trip was when things really started to shift in a way Sarah couldn't ignore anymore, even though she tried. The whole youth group piled into vans for this 3-hour drive up to some mountain resort. Sarah had never been skiing before, and she spent most of that first day eating snow, her legs shaking so badly by early afternoon that she could barely stand. She was taking off her skis at the bunny slope, frustrated and exhausted, when one of the staff members came over. "Your youth leader's looking for you," he said to meet him inside. Sarah trudged to the lodge in those ridiculous ski boots that made her walk like a penguin, fumbling with all the buckles with her frozen fingers. Inside, it was warm and loud, people everywhere, laughing and talking, and there was David sitting alone at this corner table with 2 cups of hot chocolate waiting. "There you are," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "You look like you could use a break." Sarah sat down, wrapped her frozen hands around that warm mug. The hot chocolate was perfect, sweet and rich, and exactly what she needed. David watched her with this small smile, and then his expression changed. Got more serious. "Can I talk to you about something?" he asked. Adult to adult. And there it was, that phrase that made Sarah sit up a little straighter. Adult to adult. Like she was mature enough, important enough to hear something real. Something private. "My marriage isn't what I thought it would be," he said, his voice low enough that she had to lean in to hear him. "Jennifer and I, we've grown apart. We don't connect anymore. Not the way we used to. Sometimes I feel so lonely, even in my own house." He kept going. Shared details about his marriage, about intimacy or the lack of it, about feeling unseen and unappreciated by his wife. And Sarah sat there frozen, not knowing what to say, this uncomfortable feeling growing in her chest, but not understanding why. Why was he telling her this? What was she supposed to do with this information? "You understand me," he said finally, looking right at her. "You see me in a way other people don't. That's rare, Sarah. That's special." She left that conversation feeling confused and weirdly guilty, like maybe she'd done something wrong by listening, but also she felt important. He trusted her with his deepest feelings. He saw her as someone special enough to confide in. That's the thing about grooming that's so hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. It doesn't feel wrong when it's happening. It feels like love, like being chosen. Like finally someone sees how special you are. Things got more explicit on what should have been just another normal Wednesday night. Sarah and Rachel were sitting in the youth room before the meeting started, giggling over these stupid things Rachel had made as a joke. They called them kissing licenses, these silly notes that said the holder could demand a kiss from whoever read them. Just ridiculous middle school humor, the kind of thing that seems hilarious when you're 13. David came over to see what they were laughing about. Both girls handed him one of the notes, watching his face as he read it. He chuckled, handed it back, ruffled Rachel's hair in this dad way, and walked off. But later, when Sarah was getting ready to leave, David found her alone in the hallway. His voice was quiet, almost playful. "So, when do I get to cash in on that kissing license?" The air changed. Sarah's stomach dropped so fast it felt like she was falling. The playfulness in his voice couldn't hide what he was really saying. This wasn't fatherly anymore. This wasn't appropriate. She knew it. She knew it with this sudden, terrible clarity, but she didn't know what to do with that knowledge. The Easter weekend convention should have been fun. This big youth group trip, 6 hours away at a conference center, all these kids excited to be together. Sarah found herself seated near David in the van, and it didn't feel accidental anymore. His hand rested on her knee as he drove. She sat very still, barely breathing, afraid to move, afraid to acknowledge what was happening. When they stopped for gas, he pulled her aside. His voice was urgent, almost desperate. "I'm sorry, that was wrong. It won't happen again." Sarah wanted to believe him so badly. When they got back in the van, she tried to sit somewhere else, but all the seats were taken. She ended up in the same spot, and within 20 minutes, his hand was back on her leg, moving higher this time. At the next stop, he apologized again. Same words, same tone. And that's when Sarah started to understand something that made her feel sick. The apologies didn't mean anything. They were just another part of the pattern. Another way to make her feel like maybe she was overreacting. Maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe he really was trying to stop. By the end of the weekend, he'd stopped when he realized she's not going to tell anybody. The summer Sarah turned 13 was when everything accelerated into something she couldn't pretend wasn't happening anymore. David convinced her to meet him in the woods near her house, the secluded spot where no one would see them. He gave her a card with all the details written out in his careful handwriting, words that made her stomach churn. Things about bringing a blanket, a pillow, protection that he might or might not use depending on what she wanted. Reading that now as an adult, it's so obviously predatory, so clearly planned and premeditated. But Sarah went. She told herself she wanted to, even though everything inside her was screaming that this was wrong, that she should run, that she should tell someone. But who would believe her? He was the youth pastor. He was respected, loved by everyone in the community. She was just some weird, quiet kid who didn't fit in anywhere. Who would choose her word over his? In the woods, on that first afternoon, he spread out the blanket and pulled her down beside him. He'd brought a small travel clock, set it on a rock so they could track time. Sarah remembers staring at that clock, watching the minutes tick by, feeling like she wasn't in her body anymore. Like this was happening to someone else. He kissed her. His hands moved over her in ways that made her want to disappear entirely. When he moved down her body, he performed oral on her. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine she was anywhere else, anyone else, anything but herself in that moment. The next day, when Sarah showed up at their meeting spot, David was sitting with his back against a tree. There was a backpack next to him, and Sarah could see a coil of rope attached to it. Her blood went cold. "I can't do this anymore," he said, and his voice was breaking. Like he was the victim here. Like he was the one suffering. "I'm going to tell everyone what I've done, or maybe I'll just end it. Maybe that would be easier." He gestured to the rope, and Sarah understood with this horrible, crushing certainty what he was suggesting. Panic flooded through every cell in her body. If he died, it would be her fault. If he told everyone, her life would be ruined. Either way, everything would fall apart. "Please don't," she heard herself saying. "I won't tell anyone, I promise. Please don't hurt yourself." He made her promise over and over, made her swear she'd never tell a soul. And with every promise, Sarah felt the trap closing tighter around her. By the time she left the woods that day, she understood completely she was trapped. There was no way out. The meetings continued throughout the summer. He never used protection, despite what he'd written in that card. One afternoon, he actually explained his plan. If she got pregnant, he'd researched abortion clinics in neighboring towns, found one that didn't require identification. He'd pose as her father and take care of everything. At church, David got bolder. During a youth group game where they turned off all the lights, he found her in the darkness and kissed her while other teenagers laughed and played around them. In a room full of kids sitting in a circle, including his own daughter, he sat between Sarah and Rachel. When Sarah leaned across him to say something to Rachel, he reached up and touched her breast, cupped it, squeezed it, while she tried to keep talking to his daughter like nothing was happening, like her whole world wasn't crumbling. Sarah's parents started to notice something was off. They invited David to their house one evening, sat him down for a serious conversation, told him he was spending too much time with their daughter, that he needed better boundaries. David agreed immediately, apologized for any appearance of impropriety, assured them he completely understood their concerns and would do better. Nothing changed. Nothing. Except he got more careful. By the end of summer, as Sarah was getting ready to start high school, something shifted inside her. She started losing interest in this thing that had never been a relationship but had consumed her entire life for months. She wanted to be normal. She wanted to, like boys her own age, go to dances, do normal teenage things. She started pulling away, making excuses, finding reasons not to meet him. David sensed it immediately and became more demanding, more manipulative, but Sarah had made up her mind. She was done. She'd never tell anyone what happened. She'd carry this secret to her grave, but she was done participating in it. There was a boy at school, someone her own age, who made her laugh, who treated her like she was interesting without making her feel uncomfortable or confused. Sarah started spending time with him, and it felt so light, so easy, so normal. She wrote him a note one day, just silly middle school stuff, pouring out her feelings on paper the way kids do, and the boy took the note home and showed it to his parents. Sarah never remembered exactly what she wrote in that note. But whatever it was, it hinted at something dark enough that his parents got alarmed. Alarmed enough to call Sarah's parents that same night. Sarah's mom came to her room with this strange expression on her face. "Did you play any practical jokes on anyone today?" The question was so specific, so weird, that Sarah knew immediately what had happened. Her secret, the one she'd promised to keep forever, the one she'd sworn she'd never tell, was about to come out. She started crying before her mom even finished asking the question. Both her parents were waiting in the living room. The family friend who'd called them was on speakerphone, his voice careful and concerned. Sarah's mom asked her directly, had something been happening? Has someone hurt her? Sarah found herself nodding, unable to form actual words. When they pressed her for a name, she couldn't say it. The syllables wouldn't come out. Her throat closed around them like her body was trying to protect her from speaking the truth out loud. Finally, her dad said the name. "David?" And Sarah whispered, "Yes." Her mom wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and then she asked a question that would echo in Sarah's mind for decades. "Do you have any proof?" The question came from fear, from love, from a desperate need to protect her daughter from what was coming. But still, proof. As if Sarah's word alone wouldn't be enough. As if she needed evidence beyond her own testimony to be believed. The next day, instead of going to school, Sarah sat in the police station. The chief was someone she knew from church, which made it slightly less terrifying, but also more surreal, like her whole world was collapsing in on itself, and everyone she'd trusted was suddenly part of this nightmare. Her mom sat beside her as Sarah answered questions. "What happened? Where did you meet? What did he do to you?" The questions were clinical, focused on building a legal case. What laws had been broken? What charges could they file? Nobody asked Sarah how she felt. Nobody asked what the grooming had been like, how it had unfolded, what it felt like to have her whole sense of reality twisted by someone she trusted. The trauma itself went completely undiscussed, invisible beside the facts they needed for the case. There was a preliminary hearing where Sarah had to sit in a courtroom and explain to strangers where they'd met and what they'd done. She had to prove she understood what intimacy was, what had actually occurred. She could feel David's presence in the room, though she refused to look at him. At one point, the lawyer asked if Sarah had given David any gifts. She said no. She couldn't think of anything. But as she puzzled over the question, she glanced toward David's wife and saw her nodding yes, insisting silently that Sarah had given him things. that there were gifts exchanged, like this was some kind of affair between equals, between two people who had chosen each other. And Sarah realized his wife had been fed lies. She'd been told a version of events where a teenage girl seduced her husband, where Sarah was the aggressor, the temptress, the problem. The trial resulted in a conviction. David was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. Sarah felt this weird mix of relief and guilt, victory and shame. Part of her, this deep, broken part she didn't know how to fix, still believed this was somehow her fault, that she was the one being punished, even as he was led away. Her mom tried to get her to see a counselor. Sarah refused. She had nothing to say. She wanted to forget, to move on, to pretend none of it had ever happened. She thought that was possible. She actually thought if she just didn't think about it, it would stop mattering. For 2 years, she carried on like everything was fine. And then one random afternoon, she was watching daytime television, some talk show, and they had a psychologist talking about grooming. The woman described the pattern step by step, naming things Sarah had never heard terms for before. And as the psychologist talked, Sarah felt like someone had turned on all the lights in a dark house. The woman was describing Sarah's exact experience, naming things Sarah had thought were unique to her situation. There was a word for what had been done to her. She hadn't been specially chosen because she was mature or special. She'd been targeted because she was vulnerable. The realization was devastating and liberating at the same time. The trauma Sarah hadn't processed started showing up in other ways. Severe anxiety, depression that felt like drowning. She turned to substances to numb the constant ache inside her, that feeling of being fundamentally wrong, fundamentally broken. For 20 years, she wrestled with addiction, using it as armor against memories and feelings she didn't know how to handle. The core beliefs she developed were toxic and persistent. She was bad, she was unworthy of protection, she was fundamentally flawed. She moved through life trying to earn love and acceptance, never believing she deserved it just for existing. Recovery was slow, painful. Finding the right therapist, someone who specialized in trauma, made all the difference. Sarah learned to rewrite those core beliefs, to understand that she had been a child, that the adult had been responsible, that she had done nothing wrong. Years later, Sarah heard that David was out of prison. And not just out, he was serving at a church again, back in the same community where everything had happened. When someone at the church discovered he was on the sex offender registry and asked him about it, David dismissed it as a misunderstanding with a 17-year-old, minimizing what he'd done, lying about Sarah's age to make it sound less predatory, less evil. Sarah realized he would never take real responsibility, would never be truly sorry. He was using his prison time as some kind of redemption testimony without ever being honest about what he'd actually done. That's when Sarah decided to share her story, to speak openly about what had happened. Not for revenge, revenge wouldn't give her anything back, but for the other victims who might still be carrying their secrets alone, who might be drowning in shame, who might think they're the only ones. Every time she told her story, someone else found the courage to speak up, to name what had been done to them, to seek help, to understand that they weren't broken or wrong or bad. The shame that had kept Sarah silent for so long, it doesn't have power over her anymore. She learned that the responsibility belonged to the person who manipulated and abused a child, not to the child herself. And here's what she wants people to understand. Grooming doesn't look like what you think it does. It doesn't feel wrong when it's happening. It feels like love, like being special, like finally being seen and understood and valued. That's what makes it so insidious. That's what makes it so hard to recognize and even harder to escape. Sarah's story isn't unique. That's the most devastating and important thing to understand. This pattern repeats itself over and over in churches, schools, sports teams, anywhere adults have access to vulnerable kids. The details change, but the blueprint stays the same. And the only way to stop it is to talk about it, to name it, to make sure kids know what grooming looks like before it happens to them. To create environments where children are believed, where their discomfort is taken seriously, where proof isn't required for adults to act on their concerns. Sarah survived. She built a life beyond what happened to her. But she carries it with her, still not as a weight anymore, but as a story that might help someone else find their way out of the dark. That's why she's telling it now. That's why she'll keep telling it. Because secrets protect predators. The truth sets victims free.